Hello, everyone. It's Dan Sanding from the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. Thanks very much for joining us for our Friday forum for March. Looks like we have a pretty good audience today. So today we have Dr. Tim Haney. Dr. Tim Haney is a professor of sociology and the director of the Center for Community Disaster Research at Mount Royal University in Calgary. And he's going to be talking to us about some pretty interesting social science research that he conducted following the flood. So we're really looking forward to his talk. And just to let you know, before we get started, in April, on April 20th, we'll have Steve Litkey from the Fraser Basin Council to talk about some of the flood work that's been going on in the Lower Mainland in BC. Also, during the webinar, please feel free to ask questions anytime throughout the webinar using the question and answer function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, or the top left of your screen if you're using a PC, bottom of your screen if you're using a Mac. You can ask questions throughout the webinar, and we'll moderate a discussion after Dr. Haney's talk. So with that, I'll pass it to Dr. Haney.
Hi, Dan. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so grateful to the folks at the ICLR for inviting me to do this. I'll talk a bit first about what I will be discussing today. This entire talk comes from a report that we issued through the Center for Community Disaster Research at Mount Royal University, which shares the same name as this talk today, Rising Waters, Difficult Decisions. At the end of the talk, I'll have a link where anybody who is listening can access that full report. Or if that's not working for folks, they can always email me and I can hook them up with a copy of it. Yeah, as you said, I direct the Center for Community Disaster Research at MRU, which is really grew out of the 2013 flood and the recognition that there was a need to connect people from all walks of life. So academics, practitioners, teachers, all sorts of people who are concerned about disasters and disaster risk. And so hopefully you'll really enjoy some of the work that we've done here at the center, which I'll talk about today. Before we really get going though, I wanted to spend a minute or two talking about who I am and how I got into disaster work. Slide is not advancing. There we go. I lived in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which is really how I got into doing disaster work. By trade, I'm a sociologist, so I do research on how families, neighborhoods, and communities prepare for, respond to, recover from all sorts of different disasters. That also means I'm less into the structural mitigation side of things and more into the social sciencey side of things. But I've done research in the context of Hurricane Katrina, the BP oil spill, obviously the Southern Alberta flood, and more recently the Fort McMurray wildfire. I wrote down here, of course, that my works appeared in several different social science journals, and some of them that bridge different fields like public policy journals and urban journals and things like that. One of the career accomplishments I'm most proud of is that every 2 years, I take a class of students from Mount Royal down to New Orleans for 3 weeks where we learn about disasters and disaster recovery, including both Katrina and the BP spill. And we serve the community by building homes in Katrina-affected neighborhoods and things like that. So that's a little about me. I keep living in places where we're affected by disasters, as of course many people do. And so at some point over the last 12 or 13 years, I just sort of said, well, if you can't beat them, join them. And so this is what I do professionally now. Now, most people here listening are going to be pretty familiar with the 2013 Southern Alberta flood, but I will do a little bit of background info. And that is to say that in 2013, of course, a significant part of the city of Calgary was inundated by floodwater. In the region, more than 100,000 people, most of them from Calgary, were evacuated from their homes. 35,000 people were affected by a power outage that lasted for days or weeks. And even parts of downtown Calgary were submerged. At the end of the day, the flood cost more than $6 billion in insurable damages, with much of the damage, of course, uninsurable, making it potentially the costliest disaster in Canadian history. So within that context, and shortly after that, I sought funding from SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, to do a project on risk awareness and evacuation decisions, and many other topics related to the Southern Alberta flood. That gave birth to a project where I asked several questions here, which I'll be talking about for this webinar today. And that is, were residents aware of their flood risk beforehand? How many people evacuated and who? Among those who evacuated, how were Calgarians affected by the event? And frankly, for those who weren't evacuated too, how were people affected by the event? And how did experiencing the flood change people and affect where they wish to live in the future? Now, before I move on, I do have to say the photo on this particular slide, I have to admit I ripped off from CBC, the top photo, and it is my favorite photo from the Calgary flood, from the Southern Alberta flood. And the reason for that is I have my students, when I use this one in class, I have them guess why it's my favorite photo. But I was looking at news stories in the aftermath of the flood, and I remember seeing this photo, and it was a guy, you know, mucking out his house after the flood, and he's wearing a New Orleans Saints shirt. And I've always thought to myself in the you know, almost 5 years since the flood, I've wondered if that's a coincidence or if that's a little scene of disaster solidarity. But of course, for me being a former New Orleanian, that really resonated with me to see somebody in Calgary wearing that shirt doing what he's doing. It was quite symbolic. So these are some of the questions that we've asked and that I'll be talking about today. To answer those questions, I hired a team of student research assistants from here at Mount Royal University. And what we did is we drew a random sample of 1,500 households, and those come from all 26 neighborhoods that had evacuation orders in place during the 2013 flood. All of these households, all 1,500, were sent a survey by mail in June of 2014, so about a year after the flood. All of those households were offered a $25 gift card to Rona for participating. But of course, many of those households didn't respond to the mailed survey. So in July, our research team started visiting flooded homes on foot, all 1,500 of them, or at least the ones that hadn't responded. And my students got really adept at dodging angry dogs and things like that, because there are evidently a lot of them in Calgary. At the end of the day, those home visits significantly improved our response rate, and we ended up with a final sample of 407 participants. That's for about a 30% response rate using response rate calculators that are available online. Of course, that's not ideal. However, in social science settings, a 50 or 60% response rate these days is considered fantastic. So when we're talking about working in entirely disaster-affected neighborhoods and communities, the way I look at it is a 30% response rate isn't terribly bad. Demographically, our sample is highly representative of the flood-affected communities, with the caveat that there is a slight oversampling of women. We have more women participants than men, which was not the case in the neighborhoods at large. So that's the only way in which the sample is not demographically representative of the flood-affected community. So it's not representative of all of Calgary or all of Alberta, but is representative of those 26 neighborhoods that were flood-affected. With an additional 40 residents, we conducted in-depth interviews to get at some of the reasons, you know, why they evacuated, why they didn't, how they learned about risk to their property, and also expanded into topics like their environmental views. How did experiencing an environmental event affect people's views about the environment? And so we talked about some of that stuff in the interviews as well. I'll touch on those things, but I'll spend most of the time today talking about risk awareness and evacuation. Oh, and this is, here I've got 3 photos of my student research assistants. The ones on the right are them compiling those 1,500 surveys to be sent out. As you can imagine, we, unfortunately, for someone who identifies as an environmentalist like myself, we killed a lot of trees. And then, of course, they got some valuable work experience that they've now leveraged into going to, you know, law school or grad school or whatever it is. So they really proved to be quite a competent, hardworking, and very, very smart team. So one of the first things that we asked people in the survey was about risk awareness. So the extent to which they understood that their homes or properties might be at risk of flooding. And in fact, we asked them in the survey, before the 2013 flood, were you aware that your home may be at risk of flooding? And as you can see here, about 1/3, 32% said yes, and about 2/3 said no. And I've also run some multivariate models, some regression models, which I won't show you here because I know that people's eyes tend to glaze over when you show them regression models. But in the multivariate context, we know that the strongest predictors of perceiving risk to one's home are having a bachelor's degree, whereby those who had a bachelor's degree were more aware of risk than people who didn't, as well as the number of neighbors that they knew by name. And those who knew more of their neighbors perceived more risk to their property, presumably because neighbors talk about things like floods from time to time. But I know what many of you are thinking. Many of you are thinking, okay, well, this is in the 26 neighborhoods that were evacuated. Not all of those properties in those neighborhoods flooded, and that would be true. So what I did is I then looked at only those participants who told us that their houses had in fact flooded. And then I looked at the risk awareness, using the same question. Before the flood, were you aware that your home may be at risk of flooding? And among only those who flooded, it was about a 50-50 split, as you can see here, where about half of people who flooded didn't know prior to the flood that their home was at risk of flooding. They were caught off guard by this event, and about half were not caught off guard by this event. Again, suggesting that that there's a significant education piece that had been missing prior to the flood. I'm going to talk more about some of the reasons for this in a little bit, these risk awareness findings, but we also asked them about risk to their neighborhoods. And here's what's interesting about it, that in theory, we would want everybody to answer yes to this question. We asked them, before the 2013 flood, were you aware that your neighborhood may be at risk of flooding? Now keep in mind, everybody who was selected to participate was from a neighborhood that was at risk of flooding. That's why they were evacuated. So we would want everybody to say yes, but here it was only about a 50-50 split again. About half were aware and half weren't aware that their neighborhood at all was vulnerable to flooding. These findings I found surprising until the spring of 2017, when I came across the report from the University of Waterloo. It's called Canadian Voices on Changing Flood Risk, from Jason Thistlethwaite and colleagues. And they had some findings that were really similar to my own, in fact, possibly even more alarming than my own. They surveyed Canadians living in high-risk flooding areas. And of those Canadians living in high-risk flooding areas, 74% don't think they're vulnerable to flooding. Only 6% know, in fact, that they are located in designated flood risk areas. Meanwhile, 78% don't know if they're covered from damage by insurance from heavy rain, riverine flooding, coastal storms, or groundwater. So again, there's significant education pieces that I think are missing. That was certainly the case here in Calgary, and it's the case Canada-wide, it seems. So our findings, my findings, dovetailed really well with the findings coming out of Waterloo as well. So then, to follow up on that, we asked people how they became aware of flood risk. This is, of course, for people who were aware of their flood risk. And in fact, about 21.5% told us that they became aware through experiencing a previous flood, which for most people would have been the 2005 flood in Calgary, or a previous evacuation experience. The largest segment said that they learned about it either from looking at flood maps or from general geographic knowledge. And we asked follow-up questions to that. And most people by general geographic knowledge mean, I live by a river and therefore I understand that I'm subject to flooding. 14% learned about it from neighbors. A very small percent, 3.5%, learned about flood risk from real estate agents or from previous owners as part of the real estate transaction process. And I left a lot of our recommendations that are in our report out of the webinar for today, but you can find them in the report. And one of our recommendations actually is that the real estate industry could have more of a role in education about flood risk. As you can imagine, there would be some pushback from the real estate industry about taking that on, because acknowledging and talking about flood risk isn't great for property values. However, that is a potential source of information for those who are not aware of flood risk. Friends and family, and of course some other way, sort of came in at 6 and 9.5%. So by and large, it was looking at flood maps or from previous experiences or so on, where people learned about their flood risk. So how do we understand why some people weren't aware of flood risk? And that's sort of one of the questions that was vexing for me after the research. And I was lucky to come across a piece of research that I'm citing here by researcher Kate Birmingham and colleagues out of the UK. And I'll talk about some of the stuff throughout this talk that they found. First, though, I'll mention that a lot of people weren't aware of flood risk because their properties had never flooded before and they didn't think they could ever flood. this 2013 flood was larger in magnitude than most people expected, so it caught some people off guard. But second of all, there's this effect of previous flood experience. And what Birmingham and colleagues found is that previous flood experience can be a negative predictor of awareness and worry about flooding. Now, other research I've seen suggests that this kind of works in two ways. That if you have previous flood experience at your property or your household level, that can increase awareness and worry. But going through previous floods where your house or your property did not flood can actually decrease awareness and worry going forward. So it's kind of a two-pronged way of thinking about it here. But many residents in Calgary had gone through a smaller flood, the 2005 flood. Now, of course, many people who are in areas that have flood risk didn't flood during 2005. So that would have then decreased their awareness and their worry leading up to the 2013 flood. And of course, there's also a lack of neighborly networks for sharing information and civic disengagement, which I can talk about a little bit later. But we know from other disasters that neighbors are a potentially a great conduit for passing on information about flood risk to one another. And so this neighbor aspect of it is something that we can tap into as a potential source of information. Again, I'll talk about that more in a little bit. So there's some explanations going on there. But one of the things I wanted to know, and really one of the key motivations for this project and why I applied for SSHRC funding, was to get at evacuation dynamics, who left and who didn't. So we asked, as officials warned of the flood risk, were you asked to evacuate? And this is a little bit of a trick question, admittedly, because I've gone back and I've consulted, the official evacuation notices and whatnot, and how they were covered by the media. And they were often non-discerning in the sense that people were told, if you live in the neighborhood of Hillhurst, you must evacuate your homes. The people in all 26 of these neighborhoods should have heard that there was an evacuation warning and should have evacuated. Now, of course, practically, are there some people in a neighborhood like Elbow Park, which is exists by the river, but there's also a portion of it that's higher up on a hill. Now, does everybody really need to evacuate? Well, they're not maybe in immediate physical danger by staying home, but that's not the way the message was communicated. So in theory, everybody should have said yes to this question. So this was an interesting thing to look at to figure out if that was actually the case. And in fact, 74% said yes, we were asked to evacuate. 26% didn't hear the evacuation order or didn't know that it applied to them, which I think was, again, pretty interesting. We asked people, how did you first hear about the evacuation order? And here I thought it was going to be media, television, radio, whatnot, or it was going to be social media, of course, because we live in the age now when social media is ubiquitous and we use it for everything. But 35% of people who had heard the order told us that they first heard about it when an official came to their door. This is followed by, I guess, next in order would be hearing it by TV, followed by neighbors, social media, family, etc. But when I talk with my emergency management colleagues about this, they're always quite surprised that the first time people heard about an evacuation order was when an official, a first responder, knocked on their door and told them they needed to leave. Now, I couldn't believe that the first time someone heard about this was actually when someone came to their door. So I did quite a bit of thinking about this, and what I think is actually going on, although I'm obviously open to feedback, is that people heard about the evacuation order through social media, through neighbors or family or TV or whatever it was. But for them, it didn't become real and it didn't become urgent until someone came to their door and told them they needed to leave. And so when they look back on it after a year, for many people, that's what they think about. They think about that moment when a firefighter knocked on the door and told them they needed to evacuate. That's what they remembered. So I think there's some aspect of that. However, it's also interesting that social media was so low in terms of how people first heard about it. I think there's a lot more potential to do social media better for communicating risk to people, although the city of Calgary was very active on social media during the flood. But that it, in the age of social media, that it ranked so lowly here was quite interesting. So continuing on to evacuation, for those who heard the evacuation order and for those who evacuated, we asked, after hearing that order, how soon did you evacuate? And we had about 10% who said they evacuated immediately, and then another 20% who said that they evacuated within 1 hour. So then, of course, it goes down from there, 1 to 2 hours, 3 to 5 hours, etc. What was interesting here, of course, is that 33% who said that they, in fact, didn't evacuate even after hearing the evacuation order. So again, the key here is that people either evacuated within a couple hours. In fact, if you add together within 1 hour and immediately, you get around 35% who evacuated within 1 hour, or not at all, even another 33% who didn't evacuate at all. People tended to act very quickly or not at all. And of course, what I'm showing you today is far from an emergency manager's ideal, which is to say you inform people of risk, you tell them they should evacuate, and then they in fact evacuate quickly and efficiently. That wasn't how things played out in Calgary during the 2013 flood. So we then wanted to know if people didn't evacuate immediately, what was the main reason they did not evacuate immediately? And so that question was asked on the survey as well. 30% of people said that they wanted to collect important belongings. So these are important documents or family heirlooms or that sort of thing, which of course many of us would consider to be very reasonable. A number of people, 20%, 1 in 5, said that they wanted to wait and see how bad the flood was going to be. Another 11% said they wanted to make sure family members are safe, which of course seems very reasonable. 3%, a fairly small percentage, said that they didn't trust the warning. And 35%, the largest group, actually said some other reason and then wanted to give what their other reasons were. So other reasons included, people said that they never believed it could be so bad, which of course, when you think about it, is still not trusting the warning. Saying that they wanted to wait and see how bad it was going to be is still saying that they didn't trust the warning, that people trust their own perception of risk and they trust their own understandings more than they trust the official messages that are coming through. Others said it takes a long time to evacuate kids. I had animals to pick up. I didn't have a place to go, which I think is significant in terms of thinking about emergency management. One individual told us that they were chilling. I'm not sure quite what that means. Some said they were helping their neighbors evacuate. They lived in an upper floor, so they weren't concerned about the risk because they knew they weren't going to flood. They were sick or disabled and couldn't evacuate. Interestingly enough, we were told this one happened more than once where people said, I didn't evacuate because the power wasn't out, which is of course fascinating because that's not the main criteria for when you should evacuate. I enjoyed seeing the community preparing for and evacuating from the flood. And of course, there are people who said I didn't realize how critical it was. So there's that missing education component again here. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm happy to talk during the question and answer session at the end about any of these findings that you want to talk about. So why the failure to evacuate? That was a perplexing question. And again, I'm going to go back to Birmingham's work because I just love this article. I have my students read it in my sociology of disaster class early on in the course. And what they do is they contrast what they call the information deficit perspective with the contextual perspective. And the information deficit perspective is just the idea that people lack information and that when informed about risk and asked to evacuate, they will do so. And that people who are not evacuating are not doing so because they just don't have the best information. But the contextual perspective says, well, I don't think that's actually true, that people evaluate official information coming in, like evacuation orders, as one potential source of information, along with their own past experience, along with experiences of people in their social networks, their friends, their neighbors, and so on. They consider their experiences during past disasters. They imagine how bad it could be. They look at stories in the news media. And you know, the example of this I always think is that when I lived in New Orleans, there was a man who lived down the street, and the joke was that if there's a hurricane evacuation notice and he was out, you know, watering his flowers or you know, fixing his car or whatever, then all was well and we didn't need to worry about it. If he was boarding up the windows, we got the hell out of Dodge because he'd lived there his whole life. He'd been through Hurricane Betsy in 1968, Hurricane Camille in 1969. And so he probably knew better than me. I mean, I was from Wisconsin. What do I know about hurricanes? So I use that contextual perspective, as many people do, and I interpreted evacuation warnings coming from the city as one potential source of information, as not the only potential source of information. And that's, of course, unfortunate if you're in emergency management, but it is what people do to evaluate information. So once people are evacuated then, where did they go and who helped them find those accommodations? And so we asked a number of questions about evacuation accommodations, including who helped with finding a place to stay during evacuation. And the largest group, the modal category here, is that nobody helped, that we found evacuation accommodations on our own, followed by a family member living in Calgary, followed by a friend living in Calgary, followed then in very small proportions by family or friends living outside of Calgary, and then followed by neighbors. So by and large, people said, we found our own accommodations and nobody helped us. We then asked, how did you evacuate from your home? The largest percentage by far told us my own vehicle, followed of course by we didn't evacuate. So this was, the picture that's shaping up here is that this was a self-planned, self-executed evacuation by people in our community. We then asked, when you were evacuated, where did you go? And here's what was interesting is that 35%, the largest group, said we evacuated to a family member's house in Calgary, followed by a friend's house in Calgary. Now, this is interesting, of course, because when you add those two together, you have more than half, going on 60% of folks who are staying at a family or friend's house in Calgary. But on the previous slide, we learned that by and large, people said that they didn't use their family or friends to find a place to stay. So people didn't necessarily understand that question as pertaining to using family or friends if they in fact stayed with their family or friends, which was not how I thought it was going to play out. But hotels came in at only about 5%, followed by shelters or reception centers at only 1.26%, which is fairly consistent with what my colleagues at the City of Calgary tell me about utilization of evacuation or reception centers within the city. And that's in fact about what they plan for, is that 1 or 2% of evacuees will need such facilities. And then following up on that, if you stayed with a family or friend, how close were you to this person or these people before the flood? And for the most part, people said we stayed with people who were very close to us. They stayed with close family or very close friends, and only 5% ended up staying with people who they were not close to at all. And this contrasts with some other major disasters, ones like Hurricane Katrina, which I've studied before, where you had people staying quite often with people that they were only somewhat close to, or in many cases were not close to at all. So again, that makes this Calgary flood a bit of a different animal from some other disasters. I also wanted to know some things about financial and material assistance when people were evacuated, where they got these things from. So we asked where they got financial and material assistance, and these do not add up to 100 in the sense that we asked, did you get assistance from family members in Calgary, yes or no? And so if you see 3.69% there, that means 3.69% received that, but it means about, what, 94% didn't receive that. Similarly, Alberta government, 16% got that, which means, what, 84% didn't receive that, and so on. So the interesting picture here is that even Alberta government, I'm not sure if people were counting the Provincial Disaster Recovery Program, DRP, here, but in any case, very few people reported getting assistance from any of these sources. And in fact, 77% said they received assistance from none of them. They marked no for every single one of them. So again, a self-funded evacuation and displacement for those who were evacuated. How long were people evacuated? And this was interesting. So for all evacuees, all of those who did evacuate, the mean length of evacuation, the average length of evacuation was 12.5 days. But I realized that that's going to be very different for those who flooded and those who didn't. So here's what's interesting. I divided it into the mean number of days until they returned for the first time. So this is not returning to live. This is until people returned home for the first time to visit. For those who flooded, it was 29 days. It was a full month. And for those who didn't flood, it was 5.23 days, less than a week. So again, I can't believe that this is true, but this is what they told us, and we were very clear with participants that we meant until they came back to their house for the first time, not to live, but to visit, or to live if they were coming back directly to live in their house. And in fact, those who flooded told us that the mean length of evacuation was 29 days, which seems, again, very, very long. But it points to the need for people who are evacuated to have a sustained level of assistance while they're evacuated, because in some cases they're evacuated for a very long time. In the summer of 2014, when we did our survey, we asked, have you now returned to your pre-flood home to live? And among everybody, it was almost 97%. And even among those who flooded, it was 92% had returned to their pre-flood homes to live. So 1 year later, most people, virtually everybody, had returned home to live. One of the things that the survey wanted to gauge as well was the social and psychological effects of going through the 2013 flood. And so we asked people, did the flood negatively impact your marriage or your relationship? And about 20% told us yes, about 80% told us no. What I wish I had asked here, and what people noted on our survey, but it was a little too late to ask, is we should have asked, did the flood have positive effects on your marriage or your relationship? Because many people marked that it did, that it brought them closer and whatnot. And of course, in some cases, it will do that. And similar for the second question, have you seen any negative changes in your children's behavior? And we asked about some of these changes and whatnot as well. But about 14 or 15% said that they had. The balance, 85% said that they hadn't. Once again, I wish we'd asked a question about the positive impacts of the flood on children, because we know that disasters can make children more resilient, and that children love to be involved in the recovery of their communities, to come up with unique solutions for community problems in the post-disaster context. A lot of this work on children and resilience is being done by a couple of my colleagues, Lori Peak at University of Colorado, as well as Robin Cox out at Royal Roads University in BC. And they do some amazing work on children's resilience. If I had been thinking about that and it had been in that mindset when we created the survey in the aftermath of the flood, I probably would have included some of those questions. But suffice it to say, there were a non-negligible portion of participants who did say that their relationships or their children were negatively impacted by going through this event. And so I think that's significant in terms of making sure that the proper social, psychological, and mental health supports are in place going forward. Relatedly, one of the things I wanted to know is about the disruption of something that social scientists call ontological security. And what ontological security is security and feelings of stability in a safe and predictable and stable environment. And this is something that is often disrupted after a disaster, where people say things like, you know, I'm back in my house, but things don't feel normal yet, and things just don't feel right like they used to. And what ontological security is that feeling of stability, of routine, of knowing that you wake up in the morning and your kids go to the daycare center 2 blocks away, and you see the same children walking by on their way to school every morning. And these patterns and routines of life tell you that everything is okay. And after a disaster, when that neighboring family is displaced, when your child care center is closed, when you're possibly out of a job for a period of time, these routines get disrupted. And we asked people, since the flood, have you felt that your usual routines have been disrupted or changed? 20% said yes, and 80% said no. Of course, one of the things that I didn't do here, but could have, is that I could have divided this out by those who flooded and those who didn't. And in fact, for this question about usual routines, I believe it was about 50-50, that for those who flooded, about half said that these routines had been disrupted and about half said that they hadn't been. In our interviews, people talked about, you know, all sorts of sounds and construction going on in the middle of the night. They talked about not being able to go to the gym and exercise anymore because they're spending all their time working with contractors. They talked about familiar buildings and stores not being open, or you know, being flooded and not reopening. Those sorts of things were disruptive for people in the most flood-affected parts of their communities. Then we asked people, since the flood, have you found it upsetting or disrupting that familiar landmarks like houses, schools, or stores are either gone or empty? And here it was, again, about a 50-50 split, where among all participants, half said that they found this disrupting. I'm currently doing a paper, we just submitted this for publication, with a student research assistant from this project. Her name is Darren Gray. And we're looking at the multivariate predictors of these two things, of this disruption of ontological security. And we found that the significant predictors of it were gender, were age, were home ownership, were the years that residents had been living at their current address, were whether they had been active in their neighborhood, civically engaged in their neighborhood prior to the flood, and whether their home flooded. And I put stars here by gender because that was the most significant and robust predictor of both of these questions. In that women, more often than men, actually women were between 2 and 3 times as likely as men to experience this disruption of ontological security. But also, those who were older experienced it more than those who were younger. Those who own their homes were more likely than renters to experience it. Those who had lived at their current address longer were more likely to experience it, presumably because they'd gotten more used to their normal routines. And those who were more civically engaged, more active in their neighborhood, were more likely to experience this disruption of ontological security. Similarly, again, those who flooded were more likely to experience it as well. So again, this is something that I think more research should be done on, because it's important for thinking about how we get people back to what's often called the state of new normal, where they can maybe adopt some new routines and new ways of doing things, even if everything is not back to exactly how it was prior to the disaster, which it rarely ever is. So I think knowing about that disruption of ontological security is important. One of the things we asked, sort of looking forward in the future and toward hopefully not the next disaster, is people's reattachment to place. So we asked them, how attached are you to your current neighborhood? Now we asked both how attached they were to their neighborhood prior to the flood and how attached they are to their current neighborhood post-flood. Now you'll notice that the pre-flood and the post-flood levels of attachment are very, very similar. What that masks, though, is that some people moved up, so to speak, toward more strong attachment, and some people moved down. And so what I wanted to understand in a piece of research that I have under review right now is, what are the strongest predictors of post-disaster place attachment? And what I found was that having one's home flood, having a longer evacuation, and having more pre-disaster place attachment basically is predictive of more post-disaster place attachment. So in a sense, the disaster experience itself, flooding and evacuation, is one of those things that that helps us understand who's more and who's less attached to the neighborhood they live in. Related to that is, where do people want to live moving forward? I'll remind you that almost everybody 1 year later had returned to their pre-flood homes to live, but do their shorter term and longer term mobility plans include staying in their pre-flood neighborhoods? So I asked, do you see yourself living in your pre-flood neighborhood 1 year from now? 82% did, 10% were uncertain, and 7.5% said no, they didn't. But among those who flooded, the numbers come down a tiny, tiny bit. 78% were certain, and of course the rest being uncertain. Now the strongest predictors of seeing themselves living in their pre-flood neighborhood after a year were actually not so much related to the economic impacts of the disaster. This includes material losses from the disaster. It includes flooding, whether the home flooded or not. It includes evacuation. But they were related to the social networks in the community, not flood damage. So people who knew more of their neighbors, people who were more attached and more civically involved in their neighborhoods, were the ones who said they planned on staying. This is even controlling for whether their home flooded, controlling for their income. And I've tried controlling for their direct economic losses in disaster, and even controlling for that, it doesn't pan out. The flood and the economic considerations come in second to the social considerations. People are making their mobility plans based upon the people who are around them and how tied they are to their neighborhoods, not to issues around damage or how much money they have or those sorts of things. So that was interesting about short-term mobility plans. Moving on to longer-term mobility plans. Do you see yourself living in your pre-flood neighborhood 5 years from now? The percentages drop quite a bit here. Only 55% are seeing themselves living in their pre-flood neighborhood after 5 years. And among those who flooded, it's about a 50-50 split between those who do and those who are either uncertain or don't. Again, the important predictors here are attachment to place, number of neighbors known by name, and civic engagement, not having one's home flood, not length of evacuation. So again, longer-term mobility plans are affected much more by how attached people felt to their neighborhoods even prior to the disaster, which we asked them about. For those who intended to move, we asked why they intended to move. So which of the following best describes the main reason why you may not be living there 5 years from now. Almost a quarter, more than a fifth, 22% said fear of future flooding was why they were thinking about moving. Others said the location of my neighborhood, or it's too far of a commute. People said, I want to get out while my house still has value, which in a sense is fear of future flooding. They're fearing that property values may be affected by a future flooding event. Cost of living is too high. I'm aging, and some of the people who are aging in our follow-up interviews said, you know, flooding is not for the faint of heart, and I'm getting too old for this stuff. So even the ones who are aging are thinking about aging in the context of flood risk. Or they're saying, I want to downsize, I don't have community here. So again, community features prominently in mobility plans, or I already bought a house elsewhere, which was kind of an unfortunate answer because I want to know why they bought a house elsewhere. But nonetheless, these are some of the reasons for intending to move in the aftermath of the flood. One of the things I've always been interested in, I'm also an environmental sociologist, is people's environmental views. And there's some literature out there that going through an environmental disaster, a flood, a tornado, a hurricane, can in fact impact people's views. It helps them feel more connected to people in other parts of the globe who've been affected by disasters. It helps them think more about humans' contributions to things like climate change, which increases disaster risk. So I asked people in the survey, did the 2013 flood change your views about the environment? Very broad question. 25% said yes, 75% said no. I did a paper, which I cite at the bottom here, it's already published, with a former student of mine, Travis Milnes, who's now down at Colorado State University. And it was published in the journal Environmental Sociology. And we looked at what are the predictors of whose environmental views changed and whose didn't. And what we found, again, it's a gender story. Women are almost 3 times as likely as men to say that their environmental views change after the disaster, controlling for everything else we put in the model: age, income, whether people flooded or not, all sorts of stuff that we put in there. It didn't matter whether their home flooded for changing environmental views. Didn't matter for length of evacuation, income, age, whether they were parents, which of course is interesting, because there's research out there that that parents tend to have more environmentalist sympathies than non-parents, because of course that you're thinking about the future of your children and whatnot. Parenthood didn't matter here. Home ownership, educational attainment, which has been shown to be related to environmental views in other research, didn't matter here for post-disaster changing environmental views. What mattered was gender, and it was the only thing that mattered. So disasters, it appears, at least in our context here in Southern Alberta, serve to change the environmental views of women, but not as often for men. So why? Well, in follow-up interviews, men shifted the conversation, even when we didn't ask about oil. They shifted the conversation about the environment to oil and the oil sands and the inevitability of oil production for Alberta and our economic dependence on it. In many cases, they denied anthropogenic or human-caused climate change. Although it's interesting because some would say, well, it's a natural cycle, there's nothing we can do about it. And then later on in the interview, they would say, well, there's nothing that we can do about it unless we want to go back to the Stone Age, which is a way of saying, well, there is something we can do about it. We're just not willing to do what it would take to cut carbon emissions enough to actually make a difference. They blamed other countries like Russia and China for having higher carbon emissions, which at least on a per capita, per person basis, they don't. They talked about how climate change would be good for Alberta because we have a cold climate, or how there simply are no economic alternatives to oil, so we have to keep producing it. Now, this was interesting because men we studied shifted conversations to oil even when we didn't ask about it. Women, by and large, that we interviewed didn't. What was interesting is we had women participants who said things like, well, you know, I've worked in oil and gas and my husband works in oil and gas, but I really hope my kids don't because it's doing things for the planet that I'm not comfortable with. And the flood really got me thinking about that. That was not the case among any of the men we interviewed, but for women it was. So there's a gender dynamic here that's really interesting, and I think also deserves some future work here as well. And this is kind of one of my projects. In fact, I'm working slowly on a book project right now looking at how disasters affect people's environmental views, which will come out probably in the year 2027 because that's about how fast I'm writing it right now. So this is one of the things that I found that I think is pretty interesting. Now, before I give conclusions to this, one of the things I wanted to say too is that I didn't even talk here about the economic losses from disaster, but in our report, there is some information about economic losses. And one of the things that we found, for example, is that among all respondents in our survey, the mean economic losses, this is after insurance and after the disaster recovery program, DRP, which is the province's program, after that, the mean losses from the flood were $18,304 for all respondents. But if you filter out the residents who said they didn't have any losses, whose houses didn't flood and whatnot, the mean jumped up to 78,866 among those whose homes flooded. And this, of course, ranged from 0, no losses, up to 100%. Some people said they lost the complete value of their home and whatnot. But the average losses were $78,866 after insurance and after DRP for those whose homes flooded. That, of course, is a significant amount of financial burden for anybody to take on. And we found that the province's disaster recovery program was somewhat underutilized. So out of all respondents, only 13% said that they had applied for DRP assistance 1 year after the flood. And among those whose homes flooded, only 42% said that they had even applied for DRP assistance. And in fact, they didn't expect very much money at the end of the day to be covered by the DRP. It was, again, a self-funded disaster recovery, just as it was, by and large, a self-funded evacuation. So it's a significant financial burden on people who are who have been affected by this event. So with that, I have a few conclusions from the report. Again, I didn't talk about a lot of the recommendations in this talk necessarily, but you can access all of those in the report as well. I'm concluding that there are some large gaps in terms of risk awareness and compliance with evacuation orders in the context of Calgary. I certainly hope that's not true in other disasters and elsewhere in Canada. However, again, that report out of University of Waterloo last spring makes me think that it probably is the case. Fundamentally, though, disasters are social events in that rather than people just reacting to information in predictable ways, people's social networks and their local social networks, so neighbors and family members and so on, affect whether and when residents evacuate, where they go. These things affect the disruption of their lives, and importantly, these things affect their longer-term mobility plans, which I think is important, that last piece, because quite often provinces, states, municipalities, after disasters will launch things like buyout programs to remove people from the most vulnerable places. And while I think that's good in terms of risk mitigation, it's also a difficult challenge because people have place attachment and people have networks of neighbors that are in place that they don't want to disrupt. And so when people move, whether by choice or really not, it disrupts those networks, which are where people get their quality of life from. So how can we mitigate vulnerability while also preserving people's local social networks? I think is a big challenge. But even outside of that whole context, people are making their longer-term mobility plans according to their social networks and their place attachment and their civic engagement and those sorts of things. And I think all disaster researchers should be paying attention to those really important social dynamics. So for a sizable minority of Calgarians, experiencing the 2013 flood altered their relationships, including romantic and marital relationships, their security and their trust in their surroundings, their desire to remain in their neighborhood, and even their environmental views were altered by this event. This was a watershed event, no pun intended, that affected the ways that many Calgarians think about their lives and even go about, in the case of ontological security, even go about their everyday routines and patterns. So I think it's important that we continue to learn about this event and continue to prepare for the day when hopefully an event like this never happens again. Before we do some questions, I also need to say a few thanks. That includes a thanks to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, to my student research assistants. This includes Travis Milnes, Angela Lawton, Grace Agele, Priya Kala, Maura McKinnon, Victoria Stamper, Isabel Sinclair, and Darren Gray, who have been great, not only conducting the research and, like I mentioned, dodging a lot of angry dogs. They were just tireless. But in the case of at least 2 of these students, actually co-authoring findings with me on from this project, which has been really fun to do, as well as the faculty, students, and staff at the Center for Community Disaster Research at MRU. Speaking of which, If you want to get connected with me, my email is up at the top here. It's thaney, T-H-A-N-E-Y, at mtroyal.ca. My website, where you can download a copy of the full report that today's talk is based upon, is timhaneyphd.com. Once you go there to the main site, there is a link for research. Go to the link for research, and I believe it's about the third or fourth article down on the list, which is this report, Rising Waters Difficult Decisions, and you can access a PDF of it right there. Otherwise, if that's not working for you, just email me and I will send you the PDF, that's fine. You can connect, if you're interested in the Center for Community Disaster Research at MRU, you can connect with us. And I should say, this project here, the Calgary Flood Project, and all the work coming out of it is only one of about 17 projects that has been undertaken or is being undertaken at the center. And not all of them by me, thank God. So if you want to get hooked up with us, our website is mtroyal.ca/ccdr, although I got to tell you, it's been a bit outdated because our web updating people sort of went out of business, and I just hired somebody new who should give us a new refresh and a new update in the next couple of weeks, which will be great, and we'll have a lot of our new documents and everything up there. Right now, still a little bit outdated. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/ccdrmru, or on Twitter, you can follow us at DisasterCCDR, and all of those will help you get linked in with the stuff that we're doing and the things that are going on. So if at that point, if anybody has any questions or discussion for today, I'm happy to talk about it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dr. Haney. Very interesting talk. So please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A box. A couple questions to start, Dr. Haney. The first one, so you mentioned a few times here, just at the end as well, related to how the flood may have affected people's marital relationships and their children and so on. So you were saying roughly 20% reported that there's a negative impact on their marriage, and you also mentioned that there could have been a positive impact as well. I was wondering if you collected any information or have any thoughts about the nature of the negative impact and the degree of the negative impact. And your survey was done 1 year after, and how impacts might be perceived to have changed over time, say 2, 3, 4 years after.
Sure, that's a great question. In our survey, we didn't ask about how, and probably should have, but in the follow-up interviews, we did talk about some of these things. And probably the number one factor that people talked about in terms of marriages and relationships is the financial strain of the disaster. So figuring out how you're going to rebuild when, again, average losses for those who flooded were about almost $79,000. Where does that capital come from in a context where a lot of Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck? That stress, a lot of people talked about as being a strain on their relationships, which is really unfortunate. And actually, I'm surprised it's so low at 20%. In other disasters, I've seen research suggesting it's much, much higher. And, in my own anecdotal evidence, this is sort of a funny story, but it illustrates a point. When I came back to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, my partner and I were some of the first people back in the city, in the metro area. We came back as soon as we could. In fact, I think we even came back before we were supposed to come back. And yet, with no services to a majority of the city and no stores open and that sort of thing, we drove in, and I remember seeing billboards for divorce lawyers as you're coming into the city. So somehow, divorce lawyers were able to mobilize and advertise because they know that disasters can increase stress in relationships. It also increases, we know that disasters increase rates of intimate partner violence as well. Now, participants tend to not tell us about things like experiences of intimate partner violence. If they do, that creates ethical quandaries for us about reporting and whatnot. And I'm happy to say, I'm hopeful it happened to none of our participants, but I'm happy to say that nobody told us about it, which is good news. But we know that violence happens more often after disasters too. So whether some of those negatively impacted marriages and relationships are also because of intimate partner violence, I don't know. But certainly from other disasters, we know that these things do happen, unfortunately.
Okay, great. Very interesting. Thanks. And related question, the concept of ontological security, I think is good, articulates something I think we all sense, but now there's a name for it. And so we were saying 80% of people said that this wasn't really a problem. 20% said that there was a degree of negative impact related to their feelings of sort of security in their neighborhood. Is this something, again, so the study was done a year after the flood. Is this something that changes over time, that people are, will they get over it? Do they settle into new routines? And do you have a sense of how, if so, how long that takes?
So, yeah, that's a good question. And I didn't answer your last one about, does it change over time? I would love to know in the last question about whether some of these marital relationship issues, whether, impacts on kids, whether those things do get better with time. We did a cross-sectional study just because of funding, and I haven't had time since things have been busy in the last 3, 4, 5 years. So I haven't had time to go back and do, another wave of data collection. I do suspect that as people find a new normal and find new routines, some of those things do indeed get better. So this is showing you one point in time a year later where, most people reported not having routines that were disrupted, but about half and half, so that their familiar landmarks were disrupted, and that was disrupting for them. So I think it probably would get better in time, but I think it also depends on the scale of the disaster, and it depends on the social vulnerability of the people who've experienced it. There's a book by Lori Peek and a colleague called Displaced: Life in the Katrina Diaspora, and it specifically focuses on people who were displaced by Hurricane Katrina, who are now living in Houston or Denver or wherever, and looking at what their experiences have been like at that point, almost 10 years since Hurricane Katrina, now of course longer. And for many people displaced by Katrina, again, because they tend to be the lowest income members of the community, although they've found new routines wherever they're living now, the sense of disruption and displacement has never gotten fixed, has never gotten addressed. And I think this is a place where, we always say this in every disaster, but better and more available and more affordable mental health services could go a very, very long way toward addressing some of that. And I would love to see that.
Okay, thanks. So we've got a couple questions from our online participants. First question from James. So you mentioned early in the presentation that for those who were flooded, and correct me if I'm wrong here, those who were flooded, 50% said they were aware that they were at risk of flooding before the flood. 50% said they were not. So do you think that the higher rates of 50% that were aware they could have been flooded before the flood, is this due to any sort of hindsight bias after having actually experienced the flooding?
Sure. Certainly it could be that, people are answering, yes, I was of course aware of it, a year later when they've been thinking about floods and thinking about rebuilding for a year. But what's terrifying for me about that is it means that the actual number for awareness would be lower than it is. And actually, I was surprised that even 50% of those who flooded didn't know that they carried flood risk. And so the fact that that number, for the percentage who are unaware could actually be even higher because of that bias than what we found, that's, again, points to a significant education piece that I think was still missing prior to this disaster. And that's the thing with surveying people a year later, that a lot of this is certainly subject to that sort of bias, but there is still some really useful information there. So I guess what I would say is that whether or not that's the case, it still leads us to the same conclusion that using the information deficit model, that there's an education piece that's missing where people need more education about the location of their home and what their flood risk is. But using the contextual perspective that there needs to be official communication about things like flood risk and potentially even more importantly, evacuation orders that is somehow filtered through trusted community members in ways that people will understand and appreciate and that will actually make them act. Because again, the notion that these percentages could even be higher than what we found is troubling.
Right. Okay, thanks. Another question related to the evacuation and how the evacuation was communicated. So you're saying that typically the evacuation notices were provided for neighborhoods, which might be, I guess, I would say sort of a subjective geographic area in many cases. Do you have a sense, and maybe I'm wrong, but do you have a sense of what proportion of the people who were asked to evacuate were actually in high risk or in floodplain areas, say flood fringe, floodway as designated by the Alberta government, and also what proportion of and you probably answered this, but what proportion of those people who were evacuated, what proportion of those people who were evacuated homes actually did flood?
Sure. So that's a great question. So I'll tackle the first part of it first, and the first part is of those who were asked to evacuate, what portion live in a flood-prone area? So you know, 1 in 100 year, you know, floodway or flood fringe area or whatnot. And it's I don't have an exact number, but you know, I've seen overlays of the flood maps with these neighborhood maps, and it's less than half. So if I had to wager a guess, it'd be something like 30%. So most people who are living in the neighborhoods that were evacuated are probably not at flood risk themselves, but a significant, this seems to be the punchline for the study, but a significant minority are, because that's what we found in a lot of cases. So that was the first piece of it. And the second piece of it was, now I'm forgetting what the second piece was.
Oh, sorry, it was what proportion of those, so the first question is, what proportion of them were in the hazard zone? And the second question is, what proportion were actually flooded?
Oh, so that one we're actually able to gauge from our survey, because we did a random sample of people in all of the flood affected neighborhoods. That includes people who were probably not going to flood, but were still, you know, in an evacuated neighborhood. And the proportion who flooded, I have to go back and look at the data, but it was somewhere again around at that 30 to 40% kind of range. Who flooded out of all of our participants, which represents the 26 affected neighborhoods. So again, we're talking about a minority of residents. That being said, though, all of the residents from these neighborhoods were affected in the sense that they were asked to evacuate, in the sense that they came back to neighborhoods that were highly disrupted after the flood in many cases. So that's why I wanted to not just study those who flooded, but also those who were generally affected, which means all sorts of different kinds of things for people. So right. I'm not sure that answers the question, but I guess in both cases, the answer would be between a third and a half, more like a third.
Great. I guess this is getting to the next question, which is, so you mentioned that there could be negative, so if somebody is experiencing a disaster and their home doesn't flood, it actually reduces their worry about future flooding. And I'm wondering what impacts of like providing these general warnings to the public, asking people to evacuate. And you mentioned even those who were not flooded were out of their homes for quite a few days. So many of these people were not at risk. Many people did not flood, but were still asked to evacuate. So first, do you think that has negative implications for future evacuations? And second, do you have any advice on how to improve, if it is a problem, how to improve the evacuation notice process?
Boy, that's the $1 million question. You know, I've given talks like this to agencies like the Calgary Emergency Management Agency, CEMA, and we have some really lively discussions about this, because this is sort of a you're damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario, in that, you know, if you're continually telling residents to evacuate and then, you know, the hazards don't really materialize, then of course people are not gonna, it's boy who cried wolf, people are not gonna evacuate when it really is time. Then again, if you don't call an evacuation and people's lives end up being put at risk, then of course the public outcry and media outcry is, well, why didn't you call an evacuation sooner? We heard some of that in Fort McMurray, where officials were getting that criticism for not evacuating the community sooner, such that people were having to, you know, evacuate basically through a corridor of fire. But with things like wildfire, of course, different scenario, but it was a quickly changing event where you needed a lot of situational awareness. It's hard to know when that point is when you should call an evacuation and when you shouldn't. That's actually why I'm glad to be a researcher and not an emergency manager, because I can play Monday morning quarterback and look back and collect data, and hopefully we can use that knowledge to try to do better the next time. But to be in that moment, you got to make the decision you have with the best information that you have at the time, and that information is never perfect, and emergency managers make that decision with imperfect information all the time. So to get back to your question, does it decrease compliance with evacuation orders for future disasters? Yeah, probably. But the alternative, of course, is waiting longer to call for an evacuation, which might put people's lives at risk. So I don't know where the sweet spot is. I think it's a discussion that's important to have, and I know emergency managers do have that discussion all the time, but you're never going to be right 100% of the time. It's the same thing after Hurricane Harvey in Houston. I was getting phone calls from media outlets, and what they wanted me to do is get on the phone and say, well, the emergency managers in Houston should have called an evacuation. They should have called it at this moment in time, and here's why. Media outlets love to get disaster researchers like me to second guess what emergency managers are doing. But again, these are folks who are working with the best information available, whereas I'm not, so I'm always quite hesitant to do that. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head with that one. I don't know if I can answer much better than that.
Oh, fair enough. No, it's not expecting a solution on the phone here. Okay, so another question is, so you've done the study on evacuations and how people responded to the flood hazard and so on. Do you plan any future work on looking at how people might mitigate future risk?
Yeah, so I have a few pipe dream projects. The problem is, to do those pipe dream projects, I have to get some of the stuff I'm currently doing off my desk, and that means I have to get more papers and articles out from projects like the Calgary Flood Project. And then I work with a colleague here, Carolyn McDonald-Harker, and we did a project where we interviewed 105 parents in High River, Alberta, who were affected by the flood. And we still have data on that, on how their parenting practices have changed, how the flood affected their kids and their relationship to the schools and all sorts of different things. And we've barely scratched the surface. I think we did one paper from that, which was actually more about the environmental piece of it than it was the family piece of it. So I kind of focus on that stuff, and it's just hard because there's too much to do during a day. So the answer is yes. One of my pipe dream projects has always been to look from kind of a political economy perspective, to look at the politics and economics of approving building and development permits in flood-prone places, and where we do it, why we do it, how we do it, what kinds of political and economic pressures are involved with doing it, specific to larger cities in the Canadian context. I've always wanted to do that. I've got some notes that I've been writing down about it for a couple of years now. I just got to write the grant proposal and actually do it, but other things keep sidelining it. So I think getting ahead of risk is very, very important, and it's where a lot of people, including, I know you guys at the ICLR do a lot of that work too, yeah, I think it's where we should be going. It's just a matter of time.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Good thoughts. Another question about maybe some comments on how people before the flood. So you identified the importance of the 2005 flood experience and how that might affect awareness and that sort of thing. Were there formal programs in place and actions made by authorities to notify people in some of these evacuated areas that they could be at risk before the 2013 flood, and what was the nature of those programs?
That's a great question. From everything that we heard from residents and everything that I found by my sophisticated search device called Google, everything that I've seen suggests not really a lot. That the 2005 flood happened, and then we sort of were lulled into a complacency in the 8 years after that. Of course, people in CEMA, in the Calgary Emergency Management Agency, they never are. They're always trying to communicate with our community about flood risk. They're doing things now like they're doing community-based like flood preparedness workshops to educate community leaders to get their communities preparing and making 72-hour kits and important documents bags and this sort of thing. And they're doing a lot of that important community outreach now. They're actually, I've always thought, one of the more progressive emergency management agencies that I've ever seen, and I've lived in several different cities around North America. But that said, to actually communicate to people living in flood-prone areas that you are living in a flood-prone area and this is a risk for you, I don't know that anyone has ever done that. I know that some municipalities around Canada now are talking about more sophisticated GIS software approaches where anybody in the community can go on and can enter your address or any address, and it will show you all of the hazards around you. So do you live in the 1 in 100-year floodplain? Do you have a hazardous chemicals facility nearby? What are the risks and hazards that are close by to where that location is? And I know this technology is being developed in at least one place. So I think technologically speaking, it's going to be a lot easier in the next 3, 4, 5 years for people to be aware of the risks and hazards that are around them. But leading up to the 2013 flood, I don't know that was the case, and the data suggests that a lot of people were in fact caught off guard. So that's where we are.
Okay, no, I think that reflects a lot of experience for other hazards in other parts of the world, and in fact over time as well. Not necessarily it's definitely not just a local issue. So a question about the disaster recovery program. So you mentioned that many people reported that they didn't receive assistance from outside entities for recovery and that sort of thing, and that the uptake of the program was lower than expected. So I guess two questions. Were people on the survey asked about the disaster recovery program specifically?
Yes.
E.g.,
yes.
Okay, they were, okay. And so for the low uptake, do you have a sense of why that was? Was it all just people didn't know about the program, or were there other factors?
Sure, I think there's, let me think here, about 3 things going on that people told us, either on the survey where we asked, why didn't you apply or why didn't you receive it, or in our follow-up interviews where we also asked a little bit about it. And the 3 things are sort of, 1, we didn't know about it. That was less common. I think most people knew about it. 2, and this one I was surprised by, 2, we didn't think we would qualify for it, so we didn't apply. And that one I found quite interesting, because you're talking about people who had flood losses, who had overland flood losses, who still didn't think they would qualify. Now, a related piece of that is that some people told us, I either didn't think I would qualify, or I thought that maybe other people needed it more than I did, so I didn't apply for it, that sort of thing. And then thirdly, there were some people who did apply who told us that the process was quite frustrating for them, that they would call in and they would get a different case manager than they had the last time they called in, who wouldn't have any of their information. They would ask for documents that they didn't have. They'd never get called back when they made inquiries. And so some of our participants just told us that after a while, they gave up, and in order to rebuild and get the capital for that, they took out, bigger loan on their mortgage, that kind of thing, instead of using DRP money, because they found the process too frustrating. Eventually, they just gave up. So I think there's a lesson in there about how we can do disaster assistance programs better. And this is not unique. It's very difficult bureaucratically to run a disaster assistance program. A lot of the documents that you want and you need to run it are documents that people, especially people who've just been through a disaster, don't have. This was the case with the Road Home program that was run in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina. We heard many of the same things coming from New Orleanians too, that the process was endlessly frustrating. They were asking for documents that people by and large lost or didn't have and couldn't get access to. The process dragged on forever and ever. I don't think it was as bad here as it was in Louisiana, but of course we're talking about disasters of very different scale too. So I think there's some important lessons about what could be done better there. But again, that number sticks in my mind, and it's actually highlighted in our report in huge print, that after insurance, because of course some people got insurance payouts for things like sewer backup and whatnot, but after insurance and after DRP, the average economic losses were about $79,000. So again, I think there's more that can be done, because that amount of loss, even in a community like Calgary, which tends to be wealthy, and even in the river communities, which tend to be the wealthier parts of Calgary, you're also talking about communities like Bowness, which are lower income communities. And you're talking about people there who have uninsured losses as well. That is catastrophic for a family as they move forward and think about rebuilding and think about where they're going to be living. And, for me as a sociologist, I think about issues of inequality and equity and social vulnerability. And so I think we can do better. I'm glad we have a province that has a program like the Disaster Recovery Program, but I think we can do better, and we should be having these conversations about how to do better.
Sure. And so mentioned on the topic of that 79,000 uncovered economic losses, can you break out a bit what types of losses are included in that figure? Is it all property damage, or were respondents including other things, lost wages and that sort of thing in that figure?
Right. So we gave them a little disclaimer in the survey where we told them to include damages to home and property that they had to pay for in the aftermath to rebuild. We did not specifically instruct them to include things like lost wages or money that they spent for temporary accommodation while they were evacuated or displaced or those sorts of things. We're talking about loss to property. Now, it's possible that some participants could have misunderstood that qualification and included some of that, but by and large, that was not the case. We're talking about loss to property.
Sure. Okay, very interesting. All right. I think last question here. So you mentioned earlier on that channels for information, with respect to channels for information, that social media wasn't used that much, and you're suggesting that you think its use could be improved. So how would you recommend it be improved?
So one thing I think could happen and is happening now is that people need to know that how do I say this, that the message is coming from people who are trusted rather than from municipal or provincial authorities who are not always necessarily trusted, although we'd like them to be. And so I think there's opportunities to create things like neighborhood groups, and some of those exist already. These are structures that already exist in our community to get the information out to people, to communicate the urgency of it through social media still, but not from the City of Calgary directly, because that's not necessarily the most trusted source that will get the best compliance. And I think, there's extreme potential for the rest of the community to involve themselves in the disaster recovery through social media. And I actually just did an article that came out about a month ago it's in the journal Information, Communication and Society with two colleagues up at MacEwan University in Edmonton. And it was on the Fort McMurray fire and use of social media. And what we found was that Albertans, this was only a study of Albertans, who used social media to follow the fire and what was going on with the fire were actually more likely to engage, more likely to say that they cared about the victim. I don't like the word victims, but the people who were affected by the fire, and were actually more likely to volunteer and to help in some way, to donate clothing, to take in evacuees, to do these sorts of things. So there is an effective social media that can motivate helping and altruistic and volunteering behavior. So I think tapping into that aspect of social media by giving people concrete things that they can do to help can be extremely powerful. Unfortunately, in this disaster, the 2013 flood, what was powerful in motivating action was the face-to-face contact with somebody knocking on your door. And that, of course, is probably not what emergency managers want to hear, because that's a resource-intensive kind of evacuation when you have to send people door to door to knock on doors and to get people to evacuate. I think there's potential for social media to fill in some of that gap, but I think the work could be done by organizations like community associations, not necessarily by the city itself, because that in the past and in other research hasn't been shown to be the most effective way to do it.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. So Dr. Haney, any last thoughts before we sign off?
No, I'm just really happy to be included in this webinar, and I am grateful to the ICLR for doing this and for including me. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to do the webinar. It was very interesting, and we look forward to following your work as it moves along. So just a reminder to everyone who's still online, our next webinar is April 20th, and we'll have Steve Litke from the Fraser Basin Council talking about some flood management work that's going on in the Lower Mainland in BC. And with that, thanks for joining, and this concludes the webinar.